Canada's armed forces earned a reputation as fierce and fearless in both world wars. That was, in no small part, thanks to soldiers who hailed from the vast and often rugged parts of this province north of the French River. Buse is a professor emeritus of history at Laurentian University in Sudbury, a former drill instructor with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and co-author of the two-volume series Untold, Northeastern Ontario's Military Past. And he joins us now on the contribution of Northern Ontario soldiers to the Second World War effort and beyond. Dieter, it's good to have you back in that chair. How's it going?
Very good, thank you.
When the war broke out, broadly speaking, what pre-existing skills did Northern Ontarians have that you would suggest put them ahead of other soldiers, perhaps?
Well, I wouldn't put anyone ahead of other soldiers, but I would say that the stereotype of Northeastern Ontario having a lot of bushmen and people, lumbering, jacks, this kind of occupation, we sometimes forget the importance and the actual skill levels of people who were miners, for example. They were artisans, and many of the mines were developed by mining engineers. Prospectors were usually geologists who had understanding of geography and map making. In other words, there were a set, and we had people who were bush pilots and had some training in how to fly.
All that aside, though, is it not fair to say that people who grew up in Northern Ontario are a little tougher than those of us who grew up in the South, and that doesn't hurt when it's wartime?
No, because it means that you don't need as much time for training people to put them into physical shape. So yes, they were important. But let me go back to the miners and tell, if I may, to tell one story right away.
Sure.
The Rock of Gibraltar was an important strategic point, has almost always been in wars that relate to the Mediterranean. After the Germans occupied North Africa, one of the ways by which the Allies thought that they could get back at the Germans, since they couldn't attack on the French front, is they decided that they would make the strategic point Gibraltar a place where they could have hospitals, storage places, and what did they do? Colin Campbell from Sault Ste. Marie, the Minister of Public Works of Ontario, he got together 297 miners from almost every community in Northeastern Ontario, and with them he formed a unit. They went to Gibraltar, they excavated a huge underground hospital, they excavated storage areas for armaments, for ammunition, and they used the rubble to extend the runway, so huge planes could land. The point here is that 297, all of them with one exception, came from Northeastern Ontario. In addition to that, they were spread from almost every community, from North Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, up to Timmins and further north. One was actually from Moosonee. Why is that so important? Well, let's just take it in the words of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general who used that as a base, and he said, without Gibraltar, we would have had trouble taking Africa. So there's just one example of the skills that were important in the Second World War.
Good one.
I could give you another, and that's
fire away.
In the First World War, there were many needs, or people needed to have wood. In the Second World War, it was less so because aluminum and so on, lighter planes were developed. But you still needed wood. 3 of the 20 companies that Canada formed, it's 7,000 people who cut wood in Scotland. 3 of those companies came from Kirkland Lake, Haileybury, and Sudbury.
Not a coincidence, I'm sure.
No.
The Air Force attracted I guess, a surprising number of Northeastern Ontarians because you said, flying was a northern specialty. What do you mean by that? What
I mean by that is that people like Vaudette, Patterson, if you look in their files, which are available through Library and Archives Canada, the files of the people recruiting them or reviewing them said, keen to fly, desperately wants to fly. These people, some of them had experience, some of them were just caught by the excitement of flying. For example, there was a Brotherhood of 13 formed in Sudbury and Coppercliff. They all wanted to be in the Air Force, they all wanted to fly Spitfires, but 9 of them didn't survive. Why? Because many of them ended up as bomber crew. And bomber crew had a survival rate of about 50%. But this shows the desire. And of course, some of them had bush pilot training before they actually went into the Air Force. Right.
Another group that attracted a lot of Northeastern Ontarians was a group called the so-called Devil's Brigade. Who were they?
The first Special Forces unit was formed in 1942 and lasted until December 1944. They were 500 Canadians and 500 Americans. They trained under hot and under cold conditions, and they were the main group that was dropped behind the lines. It was called line crossing, and many of those people had to be able to survive on their own. In other words, they had to have the skills of a hunter, a hunting guide, a lumberjack, and we have at least 11 of those 500 Canadians came from our area. Another one of the skills that was sometimes important is if you're going to land behind the lines and survive, you had to have the language of where you were dropped. So being bilingual in French and English was one of the aids. And if you read the names of those 11 individuals from Northeastern Ontario, almost everyone is a Poirier, a Bestionnet. It's at least the names indicate that they were probably bilingual.
Not too many Buses up there, I guess.
No.
Gotcha. Let's put a couple of numbers on the record here, and this is from your book. During World War II, the Northern Ontario Mining Company, Inco, produced 1.5 billion pounds of nickel and 1.7 billion pounds of copper, more than all previous years combined. Where was all that metal going?
All that metal is going into armaments. If you want to have good communications, you need copper to run lines. If you wanted to have ships, and of course a lot of it went to American ships, but Canadians built a lot of corvettes in Owen Sound, in Halifax, and that metal mostly came from, or the alloys to make good steel. And we shouldn't forget, Sault Ste. Marie steel mill produced a lot of that steel.
Is it fair to say that World War II represented an economic boom for Northern Ontario?
It changed the complexion of some cities. Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury grew a lot. Timmins and the ones further north that were mining mostly gold, they weren't changed so much, although they had a labor shortage by 1942-43 as well. North Bay is of course, because the World War II ends, but the Cold War starts almost immediately. And we can see the demographic growth of North Bay, 2,200 people working at the airbase.
I want to have Sheldon Osmond, our director, if you wouldn't mind, bringing up a map that we want to show right now, because Northern Ontario was also reputed for its prisoner of war camps. There were prisoner of war camps built to house 35,000 prisoners. And for those listening on podcast, we're basically looking at a map of Ontario right here, from Internment Camp R at Red Rock, north of Lake Superior in the north, to Camp 10, Chatham and Fingal, on top of Lake Erie in the south, Camp Bowmanville on top of Lake Ontario, Camp Espanola. I mean, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's almost a dozen prisoner of war camps. Why was Northern Ontario seen as apparently the best place to put these camps?
Well, some of these communities are isolated. If you have prisoners of war, one of the places you want is that they can't escape easily. And secondly, they were used for laborers, not officers, but the men, to cut wood for the war and fuel. A number of tasks were given to the workers. Some of them built roads, some of them worked on the railways under guard. But you have to distinguish the camps. Espanola was a smaller camp, 1,500 people in an old paper mill. And conditions there were sort of casual in the sense that people could go to the hospital across town. And one man apparently came back and they wouldn't let him back in even though he was a prisoner. He had to go back to the hospital and get a doctor to bring him back so he could get in. Monteith was further north, and it was a camp that had an odd complexion in the sense that at first it was made up of prisoners from Britain. Not prisoners of war, but internees. And these people, some of them were Jewish, some of them were anti-Nazi. They had left Germany to go to Britain to be away from the Nazis. And here Britain didn't trust them. And so they shipped 333 people of Jewish background and a number of other Germans. Some of them were engineers and some of them were already well established in England, off to Canada. Canada reluctantly took these people, but they were sent up to Monteith. It took 2 years to sort them all out, and then most of them were released. So it's a happy ending there. But then Monteith became a regular prisoner of war camp, from which, of course, the officers sometimes tried to escape. And that's another side of the Monteith story.
Can I do a bit of an awkward full disclosure with you here? Okay, this is going to get weird, but hang in there with me here, all right? Dieter, I'm reading your book, and I'm reading the part where they talked about people who were interned in these camps, and suddenly I recognize one of the names, because it's my wife's grandfather. My wife's grandfather there was the knock on the door, and the RCMP came and said, "You're coming with us," and they took him off and they put him in a camp. The chapter in your book that describes this says he was essentially, he swore loyalty to Benito Mussolini because he was of Italian background. And I guess they regarded him and his like as a kind of a fifth column in Canada who were a little too sweet on fascism. And I guess, let me just ask you a couple of questions in regard to that. Because needless to say, my wife has a very different understanding and interpretation of that part of her family's history. Tell us about that. How much of that happened in Northern Ontario during the war years?
In 1940, when Italy joined the war against the Allies in June 1940, the RCMP picked up a number of people, 700 approximately of Italian background, 860 approximately of German background, and of course we know many from Japanese in the West. What's the background to that story? The background is that during the interwar years, from 1920 to 1939, Italy, under Mussolini, expanded revived Italy, and many people in Canada had a kind of divided loyalty. They were really concerned. They wanted to appreciate it, that their homeland was, again, one of the world powers. In Ontario, all of Ontario, the consuls, the Italian consuls, tried to form fascios, in other words, clubs, special clubs, and some of those were in Sudbury, some of them were in Sault Ste. Marie, some of them were in Timmins, North Bay. Those fascios, as you said, some of those people swore loyalty to Mussolini because some of them didn't have Canadian citizenship and others did. So the result was the RCMP kept lists of these people. Now, were these people disloyal to Canada, or were they just appreciating their homeland? We don't know the answer. I'm sure it's an individualistic kind of a case. We do know that the lists that were prepared in the 1930s, the RCMP had those ready in 1940. So Gallardo, a photographer in Sudbury, he's then interned. They're sent to Petawawa. The Mascaroli brothers from Timmins are sent to Petawawa. A number of people. Almost everyone at Kirkland Lake had a number of Italians. They were mostly not charged. They were just held. Some of them could not see their families, so they couldn't respond in any way or get help, with the exception of the Mascaroli brothers from Timmins, because they were very rich entrepreneurs. They ran garages, theaters, rooming houses, and they had the help of a number of rich people from Toronto. So by 1942, they were also released. So it's a story that is complex in the sense that there's a background, people with dual loyalty, and yet at the same time, it's a question for the state. Do we trust people who are of dual loyalty or not?
In the case of the Japanese Canadians, with the fullness of time, our governments have decided in their wisdom that these were people who were inappropriately interned, and as a result, were due an apology and compensation. Not sure that's been the case for the Italian Canadians.
Mulroney basically said that the state was wrong to do this,
right.
But there has been no compensation offered.
Because if your sources are RCMP, we know what the RCMP felt about these folks.
I think the case is of some of the families that they were innocent bystanders, had been pressed by the Italian consulates to join up the fascio clubs. Others were quite enthusiastic. We should remember that some of them gave money to the Italian Red Cross during the Ethiopian wars, and some of them went around collecting funds for the Italian enterprises, which one can see as, okay, that's the divided loyalty issue. Doesn't make them treasonous. I would agree with that.
Okay, let's move on. Egbert Brosig, who was he?
He was a German Luftwaffe officer, and he was interned as a prisoner of war in Monteith, and there he escaped in 1942 in a laundry bag, and he's recaptured as far away as New York State, and he's returned to Monteith. 1943, middle of the year, he escapes once more, and he gets as far as North Bay before he's recaptured. So they decide to put him out west in a camp, I think it was Lethbridge, And he escapes once more, and he makes it back using the railway as far as Cochrane.
How many times did he escape altogether?
At least 3 times,
At least
maybe
3.
4.
Did they get him back every time?
Yep. But it's an interesting case. Some Espanola, 2 men escaped as well, and one was actually shot, so it's a different ending.
One surprising thing that you chose to include in your book were some of the darker, more uncomfortable sides of soldiers' lives. When they went AWOL, when they were fighting with fellow soldiers, when they were looting, when they were involved in kind of lewd sexual behavior and so on. Why is all that in the book?
I believe in what I call full and fair history. I think we shouldn't pretend that people who are on leave, sure, some of them are doing tourism, but some of them out catching VD. This is normal life. Secondly, with regard to this, the soldier happens to be from Hornpain, who is caught by the British RAF police. He is in the process of raping a young girl, and he gets shot. We think we should put the scoundrels in. As a matter of fact, I think we showed that there were very few scoundrels. Yes, people stole a few cows from the Germans and rented their bicycles forever when they occupied the country. I think that's fairly normal activity when you yourself are on short rations. So yes, we include that because we think it should be full. Just as our main argument in our book, which we haven't sort of said yet, is that we have to include the people from Northeastern Ontario in the regular studies. To give an example, 19th of August, 1942, the Dieppe raid. Who was that? Who was there? When if you read the standard accounts, it was all people from Southern Ontario in the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Royal Regiment of Canada. One identified with Hamilton, obviously, the other identified with Toronto. And yet, our book shows a list of 20 people who die at Dieppe. They're all from between Timmins, Cobalt, Sudbury. We have a list of more than 20 who become prisoners of war. And we don't know how many were also wounded and brought back. We have some examples. So what we're saying in that case is that if you talk about Dieppe, don't quote that saying they're all enlisted from southwestern Ontario. Acknowledge where these people are from. If the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, if more than 10% of its casualties are from up north.
Do you think the official history of this country's participation in the 2 great wars undervalues the contribution made by people from northern and northeastern Ontario in particular?
Well, we're a country made up of regions. And because of the fact that the units, the battalions that are formed, usually are identified with a place, they tend to be identified with bigger places. And therefore, I'm not talking only about Northeastern Ontario being marginalized or underrated or under-considered. The contributions came from everywhere. Although we can make estimates of how many enlisted from different areas. And the enlistment patterns show Northeastern Ontario was higher than the average.
Let me read an excerpt from your book here. We need to imagine ourselves in the situation of a family that receives a package with a soldier's so-called effects, as the Dual family of North Bay did. On July 13th, 1945, my grandmother received John's personal effects, a 6.5-inch by 10.5-inch by 5-inch cardboard box containing a Bible, a sewing kit, an Italian-English dictionary, a manicure set, a few small souvenirs from Florence and Rome, some spare buttons, and uniform flashes. What a small package. What a stark reflection of the last days of a loved one. And we have a picture here, if we can dissolve to that. Thanks, Sheldon. And there we are. For those listening on podcast, I'll just describe. This looks like, here's a pair of scissors. There's some stars, some medals, that kind of thing, some tweezers, just some personal artifacts. And I guess basically I want to ask, what do you think when all you see left is a handful of artifacts which are supposed to represent a guy's life?
Yep. And we have many touching letters from the families that indicate they wanted some. One woman whose son is shot down, DeMarco from Timmins, a flyer, and she writes, "Can't I please have some sign? I've given you my son," basically is what she says. And she's, November 1945, she's still asking for some effects, some remains.
This is months after the war's over.
Months after the war. We have cases that in a year and a half later, someone's asking for the person's pen and their buttons from the uniform or anything that they might have from him. The response from the Department of National Defense, you have to remember 1 million people served in this war, to keep track of all of those men, and especially on the battlefield. And there's one touching letter that I remember where one of the officers is writing to the mother. He's the officer from the unit in which the man was killed. And he said, "We have had 3 officers on the scene trying to find pieces for you." Like that's, but it's a package that came like this, and families were often very shocked at what they received. Even worse is one case from Manitoulin, where a man by the name of Wag, he's writing letters home, "Well, I'll be coming soon." And this is in April 1945. In July 1945, he's still in Germany and he steps on a landmine, so he doesn't come home. These are the stories that we include because we think it should be the story of the social life of soldiers. I don't know if you read the part where we have 493 letters sent by a soldier to his girlfriend. It's a charming set because it's so detailed about cooking, about going to the countryside, dancing, and the toughness of being away from family. And then another one of a nursing sister. We haven't mentioned women here, by the way. There were also many women in the Air Force and in the
mostly nurses?
And about 4,500 nursing sisters, and they were treated as officers. And we have the letters home from one of them from Italy. And what is she asking for? All those things of daily life. Please send more gum. I mean, they all wanted cigarettes because everybody smoked. And there were committees that are called comfort committees for the men. And they sent these comforts, mostly cigarettes, and sometimes in the case of ships, very different. Ships were named after communities, and it was a way by which to encourage patriotism. So Coppercliff, Sudbury, Kapuskasing, Timmins, every northern city or town had a ship named after it. And one of the charming things is the Coppercliff. The captain of the ship writes to Coppercliff, and he says, what the Navy doesn't give us are washing machines, radios, and then, of course, a request for cigarettes. Coppercliff's committee gets together. They get enough money that what do? They send radio, washing machine, but they send a piano to see.
And no cigarettes.
Well, yeah, they got cigarettes.
They got cigarettes too, okay. Let's finish up on this, Dieter. When the war finally ended in 1945, what impact did that have on Northern Ontario?
Well, first, it drove women out of work. Women had worked in the Coniston smelter, they had worked at the Inco smelter, they had replaced men on the CPR. Women's motivation for participating is quite direct. They say, we will join because we want to replace men. And some of them join, of course, because they're going to get a better salary, and they're going to get food and clothing. One dental assistant from Coniston, I specifically remember her saying, this is much better pay than I got. So there's different motivations for joining. But what was the main part of your question was?
Well, when the guys came home.
And what it did to the economy. Because the women then were actually basically dismissed from the plants, and the men were given the jobs back. And that pattern of the 1950s and 60s of one wage supporting a family was reintroduced.
And it was the man's wage.
It was the man's wage, yes. So that's one of the things. The other thing is, of course, in many places it caused a recession when the war ended. Until the Korean War started, you didn't need medals for ships and so on. So Sudbury's in a period very quickly of decline. North Bay, because of the Cold War and the building of the underground bunker, and it actually increases the economy there.
Gotcha. We want to thank you for coming down from Sudbury to our studio in Midtown Toronto to tell us about Untold, Northeastern Ontario's military past. This is the second volume, World War II to Peacekeeping. That's Dieter Buse. Thanks so much, Dieter.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.